All right. So, I got an absolutely wild one here for you guys. So, obviously, over the last week or so, President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, has been going around to a couple different countries and essentially asking for additional aid and support in their ongoing counter-offensive against the Russians. And so, we did a stop by over in Canada, I think it was 2 days ago now, where the Canadian Parliament, okay, they're giving applause to Zelensky throughout his speech. And then towards the end of it, I believe it's like the Speaker of the House in the Canadian Parliament does this big introduction for a guy who apparently he invited to come to this event, and the entirety of the Ukrainian Parliament, Zelensky, Trudeau, all of these people stand up and give this guy applause. And I'm going to tell you about who exactly this guy is in a second here, but let's just go ahead and see how they were phrasing this and see how the media was sort of analyzing this and get a look at the man himself.
Zelensky's speech received at least a dozen standing ovations. There was also one for this man, a 98-year-old Ukrainian Canadian who fought for Ukrainian independence against the Russians during the Second World War.
Okay. So immediately when I first saw this clip, alarm bells start ringing in my head, right? Because if you're talking about a 98-year-old veteran who served during World War II and was fighting against the Soviets, there's, especially in Eastern Europe at the time, there is a very significant chance that that person was probably either a Nazi themselves or were at least in some way aligned with the Nazis. And it turns out that is exactly the case here. You have the Canadian Parliament, okay, all of these people standing up and giving applause to a literal former member of the Waffen SS, okay, a Nazi coalition or a Nazi-linked group. So here from Ivan Kachchinovsky, he gives us a little bit of pictures from apparently way back in the day that the man himself that they were just applauding has posted on his own blog that he was sort of writing for some Ukrainian outlet or whatever. He says these are photos of the SS Galicia Division veteran who was given a standing ovation by the Canadian Parliament, Prime Minister of Canada, and President of Ukraine. He published these photos himself in this division during training in Germany. He is standing in the middle in the first photo, second to the left in the second photo, and anyways, you guys get the point. So we get a little bit of a throwback to his days as a Nazi. Okay, so a little bit more information here from Politico, as well as some bizarre framing here. Now, they say Nazi-linked veteran received an ovation during Zelensky's Canada visit. I mean, honestly, you could say Nazi-linked. I would probably shorten it and just say the most accurate way to talk about this guy is that he's just a straight-up Nazi. I mean, literally a member of a Waffen SS division. Okay, you're a Nazi, right? You're not just like, oh, I, somewhere along the way, maybe like worked alongside a Nazi. No. You were a Nazi. Like, this was a volunteer group that he decided to join within Ukraine at the time, and he chose to join to fight on the side of the Nazis. Okay, you're a Nazi at that point, right? So a little bit more details. They say a ranking Canadian parliamentarian is now apologizing, the guy who apparently invited this man to go and get this standing ovation. He's apologizing to Jewish communities around the world for a blunder during Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's visit that led to lawmakers honoring a veteran accused of belonging to a Nazi division in World War II. Again, it's not an accusation. We have the documents. I mean, we have his own personal testimony, his own confirmation of this. It's not an accusation, but they say it followed demands by Canadian Jewish organization Sunday for an apology after it was revealed that members of parliament across party lines awarded a 98-year-old veteran on Friday with a standing ovation shortly after Zelensky addressed Canada's House of Commons. This guy, his name is Yaroslav Hunka, stood and appeared to salute from the public gallery when he was recognized by House Speaker Anthony Rota, who appears to be the guy who's sort of taking the fall for this, or at least taking the blame, who introduced Hunka as a Canadian-Ukrainian war hero from his political district. And apparently this is a district within Canada that does have a lot of people who traveled over to Canada, I guess after World War II, from Ukraine specifically. And so I guess in this guy's mind, maybe he didn't know about this guy's past, maybe he did. I can't say one way or another. You would think that if you're looking for a potential veteran to hold up in front of Zelensky, in front of the the parliament, and you're looking for somebody that maybe you would do a little bit more background research. Again, it's not that difficult of a link to connect there when you're talking about a 98-year-old veteran who served during World War War II and was fighting against the Soviets at the time in eastern Ukraine. Not exactly a big stretch to maybe do a little bit more digging and figure out exactly who this guy was. You would think that would be like the bare minimum of research that you would do if you're going to pull some sort of like a PR stunt like this. I mean, honestly, at the end of the day, it's embarrassing, right? It's embarrassing for Canada. It's embarrassing for Zelensky. And I don't know the degree to which Zelensky knew about this guy or knew that they were going to do this, stand up and give this guy a standing ovation or anything like that. It's pretty ambiguous. It seems like this guy, the House Speaker, Anthony Rota, is sort of like taking all of the blame in and of himself. But I mean, this is something that bothers me, and we'll get to that here a little bit more in a second. But like, listen, I'm not going to tell you guys that Ukraine is full of a bunch of Nazis and sort of like, run with the Putin line that was one of his justifications that he gave for invading Ukraine to say, oh, we're going in to denazify Ukraine. I mean, I don't think any reasonable person thinks that that's a legitimate reason why Putin decided to invade Ukraine, to like denazify it. Like it's a completely ridiculous idea that Ukraine, the military of Ukraine, the people of Ukraine, they're all Nazis, right? Put that aside. That's completely irrelevant. It's completely ridiculous. But it is kind of feeding in to, Putin's testimonies that he's given, his justifications that he's given, bullshit or not, right? You're feeding into that narrative by pulling a stunt like this. So again, you would think that like maybe you would do a little bit more background research and actually figure this shit out before doing this, but apparently they didn't know that until after the fact. So they continue. And this is a direct quote from when he was introducing this guy, Anthony Rota. He said, "We have here in the chamber today a Ukrainian-Canadian veteran from the Second World War who fought for Ukrainian independence against the Russians and continues to support the troops today, even at his age of 98. Rota said Friday, followed by a lengthy round of applause and a wave by Zelensky. He's a Ukrainian hero, a Canadian hero, and we all thank him for his service. Thank you. I mean, fucking embarrassing. Again, they say Jewish advocacy groups, the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center and the B'nai B'rith Canada condemned his honoring and as disturbing and beyond outrageous. I mean, yeah, to say the least, because he fought with the 1st Ukrainian Division, also known as the 14th Waffen Grenadier Division, which served under the command of Nazis. A little bit more on that here from the Kyiv Independent. The 14th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS was formed in 1943. So this guy joined like in the middle of World War II, right? So like this wasn't like, oh, he didn't necessarily know what the Nazis stood for or anything and he was just fighting for Ukraine. Like, no, this is like well into the war and he's signing up for a volunteer division within the Nazi SS. I mean, it's pretty unambiguous, right? It was composed largely of Western Ukrainian and Slovak volunteers and was renamed the 1st Ukrainian Division before surrendering to Western allies in 1945. The unit has been accused of murdering Polish and Jewish civilians, but has never officially been found guilty of war crimes by a tribunal. Now, they continue here. They say in a statement, this is basically his apology, right? On late Sunday afternoon, Rota said that he recently became aware of more information, which causes me to regret my decision to recognize Hunka. He says he takes full responsibility for the seismic gaffe. I mean, again, the second that this clip dropped of people applauding him in the Canadian Parliament, everybody online was passing this around and did like bare minimum research into this guy's background and was like, yeah, that guy's a fucking Nazi, okay? It took like 5 minutes for people to figure this shit out, and you're telling me the House Speaker in Canada couldn't do any background research on this guy? He continues, he says, I wish to make it clear that no one, including my fellow parliamentarians and the Ukraine delegation, I guess indicating Zelensky, was aware of my intention or of my remarks before I delivered them. You would think, I mean, maybe they should have been aware of it. Maybe you should have run this by other people around you if that's the actual truth, that you didn't tell anybody that you were going to do this kind of a thing. It seems like maybe you should be running this by more people, right? He says this initiative was entirely my own, the individual in question being from my writing and having been brought to my attention. So I guess he's kind of just taken the fall for this. And now again, they finish off here. They say the story was quickly picked up by Russian state-controlled media websites RT and Sputnik. Now, listen, I mean, this is kind of what I was just saying there at the end, right? I mean, this doesn't help your case, right? Now, I do not believe that the overwhelming majority of Ukrainian military members or, civilians or whatever the case may be in Ukraine are Nazis. Obviously not. I mean, probably a lot of the people who are serving in the Ukrainian military right now are just like average Joes who are like working at some fucking bakery or they're a car mechanic or something, and then they get drafted into this war and now they're having to potentially risk their lives to, try to push back against the Russians who invaded their country, right? I think that most of these people are just average, ordinary, everyday, random some people, right? So I don't think that the narrative that Putin ran with at the beginning of this and used as a justification to say, oh, we're going in to denazify Ukraine, that I think is just completely ridiculous at face value. Now, it is like in a nuanced analysis here, you do also have to admit, yeah, I mean, there's a history here, right? I mean, it's not a surprise that like this guy who, you know, is being hailed as a war hero, you know, would have had potential connections with the Nazis if he was fighting against the Russians back in World War II. I mean, there are a lot of, you know, heroic figures within Ukraine that do have connections to Nazis or were, you know, Nazi sympathizers or worked directly under the Nazis. I mean, that's just like a fact. And there are also, to this day, a lot of Nazis within the Ukrainian military. Again, is it a majority of them? No. But I mean, there is some subset of that. And so you got to be honest in sort of admitting that, yes, that can be true. And also it's true that Putin using that as a justification to denazify Ukraine and invade this country is also bullshit. I mean, you can admit both of those at the same time and then also recognize doing shit like this doesn't help your cause in pushing back against that narrative that Putin or the Russians are trying to sell about Ukraine being run by Nazis, right? I mean, like, this does not help your cause. And it's not even the first time that we've seen something like this, right? I cannot even tell you guys how many times on Twitter where I've seen like official Ukrainian government accounts, right? Like the UAF or whatever the case may be, official Ukrainian government accounts that tweet out pictures of like soldiers and then, oh, you look a little bit closer and they have like a black sun patch on or some other Nazi insignia that's, you know, on their jackets or on their military fatigues. I mean, that happens all the time. And so my main question would be like, listen, there are Nazis in the Ukrainian military, there are Nazis in the Russian military, there are Nazis in the US military, Nazis are fucking everywhere, okay? That's no mystery to anybody who understands these various countries, right? But you would think that at this point, with that being such a prominent weapon that has been used against Ukraine, saying all Ukrainians are Nazis, right? We're going in to denazify Ukraine. You would think that by this point, maybe Ukraine would have figured out like, hey, let's set up, I don't know, some fucking department of people whose job it is to make sure that our official government accounts or any of our, you know, linked accounts or US accounts, you know, from US politicians aren't accidentally tweeting out like literal Nazi insignia and feeding into that narrative. I mean, like, this is the bare minimum. And then this just takes it to an entirely different level where you are literally inviting a former Nazi, okay, who served in the Waffen SS, all right, as a volunteer troop during World War II, fighting against the Russians, right? You would think that maybe you would do a little bit of background research into this guy. So I don't know if they didn't know about this guy and who knew about him, how widespread was this knowledge. Certainly, this wouldn't be the first time that some members of parliament within Canada, especially this woman Freeland, who you guys can go and look up her backstory and her familial connections to you know, previous Nazis throughout history as well. It's certainly not the first time that you know, some members of parliament in Canada have attempted to whitewash you know, the history of Nazis. And so you know, I mean, again, it's ridiculous at face value. It doesn't help your cause, especially when you're going there to try to pitch to get, you know, further additional military support, and you know, you're giving a round of applause to a literal former Nazi. Doesn't help in that narrative war in the slightest. And I mean, again, just a completely absurd and ridiculous and embarrassing situation. You know, you guys tell me, do you think that, you know, this guy Anthony Rota, the House Speaker of the Parliament, that, you know, maybe he was, you know, the only person who knew this? Do you think that this was much more widespread knowledge, and maybe some other people in the crowd knew who this guy was, or maybe Zelensky, some sparks went off in his head when they said, oh, he fought during World War II against the Russians? I don't know who exactly knew what, but yeah, I mean, this is just an absolutely insane situation here.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying